So thanks for coming to our breakout session here this afternoon. Again, I'm Buividas, Chairman of PSPRS, and we had Scott McCarty, Finance Director for Queen Creek, and one of our trustees that came on this year. There's our contact information if you guys need it. So we're going to go through, we want this to be interactive. We got some slides to go through that just kind of give a little history about where PSPRS has been, what we got going forward, and then Scott's going to talk about some different funding policies and some stuff you guys can do as employers to help your funding status. And then we want to open up for question and answer. Also, Brad Heinrich, after our presentation in the big conference room, is going to be doing the first presentation of the new modeler. So that should also be a great tool for everybody in this room as well. So we already talked about the board earlier. Again, the system, we have 236 plans in PSPRS. We also have multiple plans in Corp. EORP is a cost-sharing plan, a total of 35,000 members, about 19,000 actives, 14,000 retirees. And again, I know I keep beating a dead horse. 10 years ago, not many people knew this. Now, because of the increased engagement and everybody being more involved, almost everybody knows this. Again, we're not a cost-sharing plan like ASRS is. We are a multi-agent, multi-employer plan where, at least for Tier 1 and Tier 2, everybody is actuarially separate, has separate funding levels, has separate contribution rates. Where does the money come from? So this was from our most recent year. Now, over time, the graph has looked different, but for our most recent year, about 30% of it came from investments, about 65% of it came from employers, about 12% of it came from members. Over the last 30 years, the investment income has made up over half of the contribution rate. We'll see what happens long term. This is a one-year snapshot, and we will expect that as we get more Tier 3 members in the plan and more Tier 1 and Tier 2 members retired, that the member contribution will increase. The percentage of contributions from the members is obviously more because they pay 50-50 on the Tier 3 liabilities and unfunded and assets and unfunded liabilities. So we anticipate that to go up, and then long term, the employer contribution rate will go down. So just kind of where we've been. 2016, we did Senate Bill 1428. Scott and I worked on that together with our counterparts from Fire and other employers in the counties. Created Tier 3, which went into effect July 1st, 2017. Obviously, it increased retirement eligibility. Now for new guys and gals being hired, you got to be 55 years old to retire. You can get a reduced pension at 52 and a half, but it really is not going to be beneficial for them to do that. Again, for their liabilities and assets, it's 50-50. I understand that over the entirety it's not 50-50 because you guys are paying a premium on every Tier 3 member for the Tier 1 and Tier 2 unfunded. But if there are unfunded liabilities in Tier 3, that will be spread amongst both the employer and employee. Again, long term, it's going to reduce employer costs. It's going to increase employee costs, and it put a whole new governance structure in place. Like I said earlier, the entire board has turned over since 2017. Now we have a very active board full of smart people who really want to make the system the best system we can make it. We also, at that same time in 2016 and then again in 2018, we did Prop 124 and Prop 125. That changed our PBI. So before, anytime the fund earned over 9%, let's say we earned 15%, half of what was called the excess earnings went into the PBI fund, so we only got a 12% return instead of 15%. But in the down years, if we didn't earn 9% or if we earned under 0%, the fund took the whole loss. So it made it much more difficult to recover in good economic times, and it's part of the reason why over the last 10 years, the fund has been lower risk, lower volatility than a fund like ASRS, which didn't have that same mechanism in place. Now going forward, that's been eliminated. Now it's just a straight 2% COLA, or whatever inflation is, whatever's lower. The last 2 years has been 2%, and it's pre-funded in the normal cost of all three tiers. So this is just an example here for MCSO of the savings between a Tier 1 and Tier 2. Obviously, it does not have the legacy cost factored in, but long term, once we get the legacy cost from Tier 1 and Tier 2 paid off, the Tier 3 absolute cost for the employer is going to be much cheaper than it was for Tier 1 and Tier 2. So we agree with you guys. I'm sure you guys all think that more needs to be done. We don't disagree with you. We know it's a critical issue facing you guys in the city of Phoenix. You know, it's the highest item on our general fund budget by a long shot. Healthcare is the second highest. I'm sure that's probably similar to most organizations out there. As of June 30th of last year, we have about $9.3 billion in unfunded liability. Our unfunded liability increased by about $500 million last year. That's due to a couple of reasons. One, we're in 5.5 instead of 7.3, even though that was smoothed out a little bit. But the main reasons it increased is our mortality tables. We changed our mortality tables to use a new public safety table that increased life expectancy, which increased cost to the fund. And then payroll growth. We're not hitting our payroll, the employers are not hitting their payroll growth numbers that we have assumed in the plan. So we don't hit those, that adds to the unfunded liability and to the negative amortization. Again, we're multi-agent plan, so your results are gonna vary based on your plan. We have some plans, like City of Phoenix is right around 40% funded for police and fire. We have some fire districts that are 150% funded. So everybody is somewhere in between those costs. We have a couple small cities that are very, very underfunded that we're going to figure out what to do long-term for them. Again, it's a debt, right? It's not an option to pay it. The Constitution is very clear about where pension liabilities come up in the sphere of what debt's got to be paid by an employer, and it's got to be paid off. The question is, when's it going to get paid off and by whom? Historically, because of the negative amortization in the plan, we've been essentially kicking the can down the road to future generations. I think our current board has much more the mindset of, hey, let's get the assumptions right today in order to start getting enough money in the plan today so we don't keep kicking the debt down to future generations. So here's an example from 2001. In 2001, we were quote unquote overfunded. We had about $1 billion more of assets than liabilities. As of today, as you can see here, we have about 8.1 billion of assets and about 17.4 billion of liabilities. That's where you get the 47% funded number from. That's where you get the 9.3 billion of unfunded liability. There's lots of reasons for that. The primary reason, so our old actuaries, GRS, a few years ago, did a report for us, or at least a verbal report to the board at the time, and they said that primarily our issue was the PBI. They said 80% of our underfunding was caused by that PBI. And it was a domino effect, right? Because of the PBI, the board at the time, over the last 10 years, made decisions to invest more conservatively. So we lost all the upside of this last bull market, where ASRS, got the upside of the last bull market. So it kind of compounded upon itself. Luckily, that's fixed now, and going forward, we'll be able to invest more appropriately. So just a little bit about employer contributions, because there's some people out there talk about how the employers haven't always paid their contribution, which is not true. The employers have always paid the ARC. One thing to note is, in the 90s and 2000s, there were employers who ARC was 0. There were employers who ARC was 1%, even though the employee ARC was always consistent. But the employers always paid what we told them to pay. I don't think we have any cases where any employers knowingly just didn't write us a check for whatever their ARC was that we told them. In some cases, they actually had a credit because they were overfunded, and they took that credit to not have any contribution, but again, they took it from themselves, their own credit. And for a lot of years, they were paying less than the employers during the 90s and 2000s. Now the law got changed with 1428, where now you got to pay at least the normal cost. So there's going to be no more credits in the plan, at least not in the foreseeable future. And again, this is an example here of our funding status. As you can see here, we still have about the same number of plans that are funded at greater than 50%. We have 166 plans are. The problem is we have that blue chart. So we've added a lot of new plans the last few years. Most of them are fire districts. We have a lot more fire districts than we had in 2001. Those are all very well funded. They're very young. But a lot of our older plans, we went from 11 plans under 50% funded in 2001 to 64% underfunded by 50% in 2019. So we have 64 plans that are under 50%. That's a problem. That's what we need to address. That's what the board is trying to work on to address, to make sure we get the funding level up for all of our plans. And as you can see here, it really is, so we have a couple different categories. I don't know how that works. There's 6 or 7 plans that represent a very, very small number, represents $140 million of liabilities. That's Bisbee, Benson, and South Tucson. Those 6 plans represent this little graph here, and they're all less than 5% funded. The next group is all the big plans, right? About most of our debt here, 7.6 billion, is in 25 to 50% funded, and that's all your big plans. That's the Mesas, Tucsons, Phoenixes, DPS, MCSO. And so that drags down the aggregate funding level, because if you look here, most of our plans, 87 of our plans are 50 to 75% funded, and then 53 of our plans are 75 to 100% funded. So most of our plans are well funded, but it's this group right here. This group is very small, so it doesn't really do much to the funding level. But this group right here, which is all around 40% funded, upper 30s to lower 40s, drags that aggregate down to 47.7%. Thankfully, in Tier 3 right now, we're actually overfunded by about $3 million. So Tier 3 is still very new. The first Tier 3 person was hired in July of 2017, so we only have 2 years of data. So far, when we instituted Tier 3, the board used a more conservative assumptions. We used 7%. We used less payroll growth, stuff like that. We've not changed any of those yet because we're waiting for Tier 3, to get a little bit more mature so that we can see what long-term their actual results will be. Recent changes by the board. As you guys know, we have Brad Heinrich in the back of the room from Foster & Foster. He's doing the modeler presentation in the big room next session. We hired a new actuarial firm. We had GRS for about 10 years. Foster & Foster has been a breath of fresh air for the board. They're very creative. Brad actually speaks like a normal person, not like a normal actuary, so we appreciate that. No, but it's great because he actually has brought to the board where he can simplify the concepts for everybody on the board, and we can make decisions based on those. Before, GRS never brought to us that we had a payroll growth problem. The very first day, Brad came in, he goes, hey, you guys have a huge payroll growth issue. You guys have a huge amount of negative amortization in this plan. So just stuff like that has really been a good help. We hired a new legal counsel. Kevin O'Malley from Gallagher Kennedy is the board fiduciary counsel. We've approved a new asset allocation. We're going to take more risk, but we're going to do it in a smart, opportunistic way, like in the late 2018 when the market took a 15% dive. We put some more into the stock market, right, because it took a dive. We didn't think the recession was coming. Right now, the market's at an all-time high, so we're probably not putting any more into the stock market today because it's at an all-time high. We completed an outside IT assessment, which is going to make us have great strides in our IT department. As I said this morning, one of our top focuses is on fixing our IT problems. We terminated our administrator due to HR issues, as everybody in this room I'm sure knows. We hired Mike Townsend, who's been great so far as our new administrator. He's a breath of fresh air. He's really going to put us on the right track. And then as Mike went over in the opening session, we had some concerns reference our accounting / CAFR that we have kind of figured out over the last couple months. So here's some key goals for us. The first goal is to get our assumptions right. Our assumptions have not been right for a long time. And again, are they going to be right? No, they're not going to be right? Because the assumption it's a measure of a moment in time, right? So we can assume something today, tomorrow it could be something completely different. So we're going to, the best we can, we're going to get our assumptions close to perfect as possible. They're not going to be perfect because they're assumptions. Increase stakeholder involvement. I think, like the success of this, we have 425 people. We had to turn people away today. It's great. I mean, if you see Scott and I and others have been out doing presentations to city councils, doing presentations to stakeholder groups. We want to be involved. You guys want us to come out and talk to your guys' groups, let us know. We'll come out. We're also going to report investments in dollar amounts instead of just percentages. And we're going to shift the emphasis to contribution amount, not percent of payroll. We're going to shift it to so you know what your total dollars is, not what the payroll is. Again, the modeler, we're displaying that here in a little bit. And it will allow you to do what-if analysis, allow you to really get a hold of your plan and figure out, hey, how can I make this sustainable? And then I think Scott talked about a little bit, the 115 trust. We're going to the legislators this year to get 115 trust to give you guys another avenue to invest your money. So some actuarial assumptions. So for this current report that just went out, we reduced the interest rate by 0.1%. We used the new mortality tables. And going forward, I mean, our main focus is on getting these assumptions right and on the payroll growth. The payroll growth is going to be a big discussion amongst the board for the next 4 or 5 months. So again, stakeholder involvement, like I just said before, we're going to be more visible. We're going to get our advisory committee back up and running and give them some projects to do. And we want you guys to be part of these discussions. Come to our board meetings over the next 4 months, 5 months. We want your input into these changes because if we all of a sudden tomorrow go, hey, we're going from payroll growth to level dollar, that could be a huge increase to your pension costs next year. So we want your guys' input. We want to do this together as a team, not just us saying, hey, we're going to give you a huge bill next year. You're not prepared to pay for it. So with that, I will turn it over to Scott.
You want to take some questions there, Will?
Yeah, any questions? Yeah, Dave.
You knew I was going to ask a question, Will. So you made a bullet point on type of amortization. What are you guys considering as a board for the types of amortization that you guys are looking at?
So right now, it's closed amortization. It's a closed period. Most of the plans are at 17 years. We have a few plans that are at 27, 28 years that they re-amortize. We're looking at possibly for the new debt going to layered amortization because our actuaries tell us that it might make a more consistent way to pay it off and limit the volatility. Any other questions? All righty, Scott.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. That's kind of a weak response, Peter. Yeah, I know it is after lunch. So just so we get a sense of the audience and who's here, because as we've alluded to several times, we've kind of expanded, who we've invited. So how many here are actually employers, finance people, budget people that actually get to deal with this? I knew we'd outnumber the rest of them today. The rest of you, are you members? Are you local boards? Give me a sense of local boards. Okay, that's important to have your perspective here and hear some of the discussions that are going on. So let me try to start connecting some of the dots. I don't know how many of you heard Harry Papp, our investment committee chair, talk earlier today. But what we're starting to see is we feel like we've got a real good plan and program on the investment side, right? And Harry's pretty convinced that over the next 20 or 30 years, we're going to earn 7.3% in the trust. But the reality is for us as employers, we're probably not going to earn 7.3 in the next 3 to 5 years. The economy's just not going to let that happen. So what does that mean for us? It means our employer contributions are going to go up. And one of the messages that Will and I have been, communicating since last summer is that's the reality. You've got several things affect the contribution rates for the employers. It's obviously the investment return Brad's brought to us now, the payroll growth assumption. We've got amortization, negative amortization. So we've got multiple equations that we're trying to solve, and all of them are going to result in contributions going up in the near term. And so one of the most important things that the board has done over the last 6 months when we hired the actuaries is to have them create a modeler. Okay, and Brad's got a session after this. We're in a half an hour. He's going to show you at a high level where you're going to be able to go into your plan, change your assumptions as the board's having our conversations over the spring, and understand what that means to you. And I can't emphasize enough what Will talked about. We need your feedback as we go through this. There are a series of decisions we have to make, and we're trying to make those as we go. And we're trying to communicate that to you all as we go. So if you pull up the agenda for tomorrow's meeting, our board meeting, you will see under the actuarial agenda item, there is a draft of the system's pension funding policy for fiscal year 21-22. That's the decisions that we're making now. That's when they'll take effect, is July 1st, 2021, not the July coming up. So follow along every meeting with that agenda item, and you will see where the board is headed. Okay. One of the things that we sort of coalesced around at the last meeting was we don't want any plan out there adopting rates that result in negative amortization. So that means if you have a $100 million unfunded liability today, when we set those rates for 21-22, we want that $100 million to be some number less than $100 million. That is not the case right now with a significant number of our plans. The amount of their unfunded liability today is going to grow for the next 4 or 5 years. It'd be a little bit like having a mortgage. You buy a house for $250,000, and 5 years later you owe $300,000 on that mortgage. It just doesn't make any logical sense. And through the hard work of our actuaries and the board, we've understand that, and we really believe that we've got to get that fixed. We're not quite sure how to do that, but we are starting with the objective. So I wanted to, before I get into some of the slides, I really want to set the table that we are going to be making some decisions that are going to have impacts on you. And we've provided you at least one tool with the modeler to do that. And as I've said, some of my close CFO friends out there, I've said, send your staff to our meetings. Have them see and touch and feel what we're doing there and what we're talking about. It's very helpful for that process. We're going to make decisions tomorrow and in February that will affect you July 1st of 2021, and we need your feedback on that now. So that's a little bit of background. So some of the things that are out there we want to make sure people are doing, we want to make sure people are aware of. The first is the pension funding policy that's required under state law. It took effect July 1st, 2019. From my perspective, I was part of the person who helped draft that legislation. I think it's a powerful tool. Unfortunately, nobody's done anything with it yet. We haven't looked at all the pension funding policies and see the commonalities or the differences and be able to provide some feedback back to everybody. So that's one of the things we got to do. We've got all this information there, but we haven't had a chance to do it. The Know Your Plan is something we've been talking about for a long time. But again, here, I think with the modeler, you're actually going to now have a tool that's free and included in your membership, if you will, to PSPRS, where you can sit there and you can toggle in interest rate assumptions, amortization types, payroll growth numbers, and you're going to get a sense what I call what your band is, what your lowest payment could be, and what your highest payment can be. And it'll give you some long-term, short-term, and long-term planning information. The next one is something we've been talking about for several years, which is make your payment if you can July 1st. Get that money into the system sooner rather than later, and allow the really smart investment people to invest that. We can, if we have extra money laying around, and I'll talk about the Section 115 in a minute, but we can only invest that in 5-year maturities and some other restrictions. PSPRS doesn't have those kind of restrictions. So all of the things being said, if you gave them $1 July 1st and you took that same dollar and tried to do it yourself, chances are over time they're going to outperform you, especially when you get into the number of years. So this is just a slide that kind of shows you when we started promoting this concept back in 2015, there was 3 employers that did this, and in 2019, almost 45% of all the employer contributions were made in one day, July 1st, 2018. So it was over $560 million. So that means cities like Phoenix and Mesa and Gilbert, and I see Scottsdale out there. I'm not sure, but these are the big cities that made either all of their payments or most of their payments. And think of it like average dollar investing. If you do that year after year after year, it can only do anything but help build the interest that you're earning in your plan. So this is just a history of where we've been with that thought. The other thing that's come up recently, it isn't this slide, I'm going to detour for a second, but you heard some information this morning about the Section 115 trust as a pension stabilization fund. So think of that like a parking lot. We have some cities out there that have set aside money internally to maybe give to PSPRS, and then they decide down the road to actually give it to PSPRS. Well, the Section 115 allows them to put that money in an irrevocable trust now, and then the only place it can go is to PSPRS. So hypothetically, if a city had $20 million in this internal reserve fund, they would put that in the Section 115, and then they could release that at any time or at any increment that they wanted to. So if they thought their pension costs were $2 million higher next year than they wanted, they could just take that $2 million out of that pension stabilization fund and not have to go get it out of their operating budget where it could have, expenditure consequences. So it's irrevocable. It means once it goes there, it can only go to the trust, but you get to decide when it goes to the trust, and while it's there, you get to decide how that money's invested, okay? And we're going to offer 2 or 3 investment options like you would with your 457 or 401A plans, administered by the trust, and keep it kind of simple. But one of the criticisms we had is we had some employers who thought that the system was taking too much money with their risk given the financial condition of their system. And in Queen Creek, I was one of those. We have a plan that's basically 100% funded. I want to control that money a little bit more than I did if I just give it to PSPRS. So there's a lot of options about that Section 115. We've got a lot of support going through the legislative. I don't know if that's the kiss of death. I've been doing this a long time. It's being very supportive, so I'm kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop. But as you need any more information about that, let me know. Let the people at the system know, and we can get you that information as this makes its way through the legislative process. So again, another tool that we're kind of trying to create for you because we know contribution rates are going up. Okay, we cannot stop that from happening, unfortunately. So that was my sidebar. I'll come back on script right now. So under employer recommended practices, everybody has a one-time option to re-amortize your plan back to 30 years. And this schedule here just shows sort of in the aggregate by the number of plans and the amount who's done that. And there's 2 things that stand out. Most of the plans have not re-amortized. So this is way back when they started at 30 years. They've got 16 years left as of June 30th of 2019. So they're really sort of on the downward slide like your mortgage. You're paying a lot more of your principal now than your interest. But that's not even half of the total assets that are in the plan. And that's the second takeaway, is most of the plans, in terms of who had the largest unfunded liabilities, 4 years ago decided to re-amortize to 30 years. And those are the plans that are in that negative amortization. So this, again, is just a fact sheet, but it gives you some perspective. When we look at stuff as trustees, we're looking at not only the number of plans, but also the dollar amounts. And this is sort of like the 80-20 rule. We got 20 plans that are a little bit over half of everything that's going on, okay? And so to Will's point earlier, it's like three-dimensional chess for us. We've got this group of employees we're trying to deal with for their situations, and then we come over here, and then we come over here. And the good news is the trustees are committed to doing that. The bad news is that that's never been done before. And so we're trying to figure this out a little bit in terms of process and approach as we go. But I do believe we've got the talent on there to figure this thing out. The other little kind of nuance here that we're pushing, especially or applicable to your fire plans, you get that 2% fire insurance tax. Don't take that as a deduct from your contribution. Just make it in addition to. Again, just trying to put more money into your plan. Be aware of your local board practices. You know, maybe if you come to this conference next year, skip the finance section and go to the local boards and understand really from the finance perspective how that process works, what the process is not only internally but externally. Again, just because there's a relationship between your financial condition and the practices of your local board. And you need to understand what that relationship is. It's unique to every employer out there. Went the wrong way. Wrong way, wrong way. Okay, so now we've talked about sort of the gloom and doom. Hey, it's coming. We know contribution rates are going up. We're creating tools. We're giving you actuary modeler. We're giving you the Section 115. And part of this is just exchange of ideas about funding thoughts. So we have a couple, obviously, is make as many additional contributions as you can. You have to prioritize that at the local level. You know, there's 10 different ways that dollar can get spent. We understand that, but again, the modeler will help you see the value of making that additional payment to PSPRS. It's a tool we've never had. Give some thought to the Pension Stabilization Trust as a way of getting more, but you still have control over it. And then if there's any new revenues or I know there's some talk, and maybe Will can comment on this, about the proposed marijuana legislation, and some of that tax revenue might come to PSPRS, and it's not going to be a silver bullet, but again, it'll be another tool that could be used to address the financial condition of the individual plans. So with that, I'm not sure how we're doing on time, but we want to kind of open it up for questions and comments, because you've heard now about the investment side. You kind of heard about, from a strategic perspective, where the board is headed. You get a technical update with Brad on the actuarial model, but I want to hear your feedback about how we're doing about communicating, how we're doing about process, how we're doing about letting you know what we're doing, because we are going to be doing some stuff over the next 3 or 4 months, and it's going to affect you. And that's part of why I'm glad you're all here, so you can kind of hear that message in person. Anybody dare to be the first one? Yes?
I've got 2 or 3.
All righty, then I think we'll be good on time.
The only thing you picked up was my kick the can down the road. Number 1, on the thing that we have to file every year, 2018, I think it was.
The pension,
Started it, yeah, the funding.
the funding policy?
How do we check on the asset when we don't really know how much you have paid in to the pension? We don't get that. We get a estimated contribution. But we have paid extra since the year 2004. And only once or twice, when we got the 86 report, were we able to check the amount we actually put in. That's number 1. Number 2, we've paid every year. When do we get that interest? You're saying paying at the beginning of the year. We prefer to pay it at least quarterly or throughout the year. So we miss a quarter's interest. I hate to miss it, but if we do, we do. But do we get this if we go in at 6 months? Do we get it if we go in at 9? Because we use a lot of this money to cover our expenses in the first quarter rather than borrowing money. Then the third thing, which is one of my big ones, we're a small district. Tier 1 and 2 are not like a normal pension. They've got an end. We are losing people. When we lose those people, we don't get them back. The fact that we are using statistics that are 2 years old in the very beginning say that there's a good chance we will not have the number of people or the payroll that are being used as the base for your contribution. As a result, we turn around and underfund ourselves even when we're trying to overfund ourselves. Why can't we change that at least at the beginning of the year? Well, this year we had 11 on our actuarial report, but we only have 9. We had 2 that took a drop right away. Well, we lost their contribution.
Right.
We lost our contribution. We are basically down over 22%, probably closer to 30% from what's requested. The actuary, we are smart at times, does put in a little quote up front that we should pay what they have suggested. They're careful not to say the percentage. What we try to pay is what they suggested in dollars. You can redo this just by changing your personnel at the beginning, but everybody has trouble doing that. In fact, they have a little trouble getting our assigned money to the right spot. So those are basically my questions. I could come up with more, but I'll stop here.
Yeah. Yeah, so you know this guy, you let him in? Chris, will you take care of this guy? Come on. Let me just make some general comments, and it goes to the spirit of what you're talking about. We can have staff get with you after to work out the details. But all the questions you asked and the information, that's the type of stuff we need to make sure is clearly communicated to the employers, okay? Because we're asking you to do things, keep an eye on stuff and follow up on stuff and watch things. And so just a couple general responses. One is going back to that theme of knowing your plan. You're right. And it's like when we all went through the Great Recession and we stopped hiring people, and it's all a percent of payroll, right? And so you have a lower payroll, same percent. In absolute dollars, you weren't contributing enough. So that's the same thing happens when somebody drops. So shift your focus as much as you can to the absolute dollar you need to be paying to the system. Look at it like you do a debt service payment. It is a number, it has a principal component, and it has an interest component. And in this case, it's going to move a little bit based on your number of employees. But try to get to that mindset. I think that'll help. The modeler will help. I don't want to keep coming back to that. But just understanding when we did the task force, we had one of the classic lines of Al McGuire. I don't know if some of you know Al McGuire, the economist. He goes, "We don't pay anything in percentages." People don't understand percentages. They don't understand employee percents. They don't understand employer percents. That's just a way to get a piece of information from your entity to the system and turn it into a dollar amount because it's off a payroll base. Look at everything in dollars. That's what we deal with in our day-to-day job. And we've set that up ourselves as a system, and we're trying to unwind that. But to your point earlier, the last point I want to make, those actuarial projections are just the minimum required amounts. And if you pay the minimum and you miss on the assumptions, it means you didn't pay enough. That's Will's point. We lost $500 million our unfunded liability grew by $500 million last year. The employers paid $1 billion. In simple terms, that means they should have paid $1.5 billion. We missed by 50%. So forget the percentages. Questions? Dan, you got a question?
Yeah, just is it the board's philosophy that every plan should ultimately be 100% funded? Is it always 100%, or is there some argument for, maybe 90 is good enough? Or just give your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think individual trustees probably have different opinions. Where my focus now is just getting rid of the negative amortization, right? Because if you think about funded status, arguably in the economy like it is now and how we're invested, you should probably be at like 120% funded because you're going to assume the stock market goes down. So funded status to me is somewhere between 80 in a really bad economy and probably 120% in a good economy. So again, it's that band. But me personally, and to Dan's point, that needs to be reflected in your policy. What are your thoughts about 100%? Are you okay at 75? Or are you okay at 120? That's part of the individual legislative action you can take, reflected in your policy. It would be great if we looked through 230 policies and we saw that everybody's okay at 75. That would provide us some information, and we haven't had a chance to do that. That's the importance of those policies, so I appreciate the question. Do you have something to add there?
Yeah, I think right now the board's focus is on just taking everything one piece at a time, right? We want to get the thing fixed. Right now the low-hanging fruit is negative amortization. We realize that's a problem. We want to get that fixed as soon as possible. Might be difference for different people, but that's number one. And getting the assumptions right, that's number two. Back to something you spoke earlier about revenue. So there is the marijuana bill is going to be on the ballot this year. Polling shows it looks like it's going to pass, regardless of your opinion of marijuana or not. One thing that is in that bill, though, is a third of the tax revenue, which is estimated to be between $250 and $300 million a year, so be 80 to 100 million, is going to PSPRS. So a third goes to education, a third goes to PSPRS, and I forget where the last third might be Health and Human Services. So the language in the initiative is very, very vague. My understanding is, from talking to the developers of the initiative, the intent is, if it passes, that the next session, so in 2021, the legislators would come in and actually make statutes based on the intent of the initiative. So that there will be some money there. Obviously, we're going to have to figure that out through the legislative process, how that money gets divided up amongst the plans. There could be some argument that you got Bisbee, Benson, and South Tucson, that maybe for the first year we should give them more money to get them at least up to the average and before we spread out amongst everybody else. But that is going to be something that will be forthcoming if marijuana does pass later on this year. And then we'll have to wait and see how the legislators, working with all the stakeholders, end up trying to distribute that money. Yes, ma'am.
You answered my, oh my God, it's loud. You answered my question a little bit on what PSPRS would do with that money, like whose plan it would go to. Do the employers get a voice?
No, that's my point. I think that's going to be a collaborative effort. But I'll just tell you, there are a lot of people in this room, just from a personal point of view, Bisbee, Benson, and South Tucson are in major trouble. Their plans are all under 5% funded, and it's not their fault. So at some point, we as a group, collective group here, are going to have to figure out what we're going to need to do to help them out. The PBI impacted those three cities probably more than any other city. So what happened with the PBI was 4% of the average. So if you came from a small city that had low pay, your guys were getting 8, 10, 15% raises in retirement. And so their unfunded liabilities increased dramatically more than the average in the plan because they were small, low-paid employers. So at some point, we as a group, as a state, are going to have to figure out what we can do. This is kind of off subject, though, but to help those 3 plans, or those 6 plans, are under 5% funded. We're not going to be able to invest our way out of getting them to 100% funded. So that's just anecdotal information to chew on, I guess. So, yes, sir.
You said the employer contributions are expected to increase. Will the employee contribution increase?
Not for Tier 1 and Tier 2. Tier 1 and Tier 2 are set in statute. And the Supreme Court ruled in the Hall case a few years ago that that's a contract, the first day of employment, that cannot be diminished or impaired to the slightest degree under the state constitution. So for Tier 1 and Tier 2, no. For Tier 3, yes. I mean, for Tier 3, currently it's overfunded. Thankfully, knock on wood, that keeps happening. But if there's any unfunded liability in Tier 3, that will be split 50-50 between Tier 3 employees and employers. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. I just want to commend the board and staff. This is really valuable information over the past several years attending these. And maybe this goes on right now, or maybe you've thought of it, but for the elected officials and the governing bodies of employers, is there some kind of training or pension 101 that could go on for those groups?
No, I don't, not currently. Now, Scott and I have gone throughout the state doing, if they want to come have us do a presentation to your council, we'll walk them through. We have a pretty detailed PowerPoint we go through, points out a lot of these concepts, but there's no formal sort of training program at this point other than us going out doing presentations. We are in our admin bills, I think you heard earlier, for local boards, we're going to get some formal training, required training for local boards. Maybe that's the next step of that, long term.
Yeah, the only thing I was going to add that has come up in preliminary conversations is at the annual League of Cities and Towns Conference, we now have a standing conference, like a slot there, a session. Right. But one of the things that has come up is maybe offer some training to elected officials. I'm impressed that I've met, there's a councilwoman here from Paradise Valley, and it kind of takes your initiative to go out and learn about that, and we need to bring that to you. So whether it's us partnering with the league when you're all down in Tucson or up here every other year, but that's a great suggestion. We can do that. They do budgeting 101, and obviously this is a part of that, pension 101, although it's never that simple, but thanks for that feedback. Any other thoughts or perspectives out there? Anything you all are thinking about that other people can be aware of in terms of tools? So just remember, we got the modeler, and we got section 115. So when we're here a year from now, I'm sure we'll have more tools, but those are the only ones we've got now. Anybody else have anything that they're thinking about or looking at? Back here.
So when you do review the employer's submitted pension funding plans, like what do you expect to do with those results? Like give recommendations to employers or publish them, or, I mean, like what is the plan?
I think that it's all of the above. I think it's like anything when you come up with the idea and then you get the 230, let's just keep it simple, 230 policies. I think when you read through them, you're going to see a common theme, whatever that might be. And as the system, we've just got to process that and then provide that feedback back to the employers. Was it just something you did, you threw on your agenda, you copied it from the neighboring community and you just replaced their name? I mean, it's okay to admit that. I do that all the time. Or did you really have a robust discussion with your counsel that said, hey, I walked them through the actuary report, here's the proposed changes to the pension funding policy? Because to the question earlier, that's really how you should be memorializing your expectations to the system. And that's an important tool for us to go out and look at and share perspective. So it's just one of those things. Everybody submitted it last year, and we just got to catch up with the paperwork. I think there's some value and some gold in those documents. We just haven't had the time to get through it yet. So hopefully under the new administration, that can be reprioritized as such. In a year from now, we can share that perspective with you. So thank you for that question. Another question back there?
Hey, Scott, you mentioned you helped draft that legislation for the pension funding policy requirement. Can you talk a little bit about the history, why that requirement came about? What was the impetus? What was the purpose?
Yeah, that was as the chair of the league's task force that was, preceded that by a couple, 3 years. We spent a lot of time studying what was going on across the country. And I think it was a couple states like South Carolina and Rhode Island where they had a lot of robust reporting requirements, not only to the legislature and to the board and to the employers, but also the retirees and the member. And that was one of the things that, as we looked at like 6 or 8 states, that pension funding policy kept coming up. And the disconnect for us was that the system's pension funding policy really wasn't as detailed as we needed it to be as trustees. And that's what we're kind of seeing now. We've asked you all to do your pension funding policy. And as I alluded to earlier, we're literally in the process now of updating ours. So it's just that communication and that connectivity between our policy has to be reflective of your individual policies on some level. And it's going to be hard to do with 230 of them, but we've got to get started on that process. So just the visibility of that, I think, is very helpful. And then the other thing, it was a way to make sure this issue is getting in front of the elected officials, because you have that requirement that they, even if you throw it on consent, at least it provides an opportunity for topic and discussion at whatever level is comfortable at the local entity. So there will be more to come on that once we can put some resources to it.
I think that we're up against our time.
All right, so I'm sorry for those of you that have to go listen to Brad next.
Thank you guys for coming.
Thanks.